Hello and welcome to the Global Discovery Series sponsored by Penn Alumni Travel and Education. As we wait for more guests to join us, I encourage you to introduce yourself using the Q&A icon on the right side of your screen. Let us know who you are and where you're logging in from. I'm Emily LaRosa. I'm Assistant Director of Penn Alumni Travel and Education, and I will be facilitating Q&A at the end of your session. Again, as we wait for more guests to join us, let us know who you are and where you're logging in from using that Q&A button. Take a quick look to see if anyone has responded yet. On your screen, you'll notice that some of our upcoming programs are listed, including Virtual Alumni Weekend, Join from Anywhere. So I hope you can join us for one or more of these events. You can join us from any part of the world. Alumni Weekend will be virtual again this year, and you can find all of the wonderful programming at that website there, alumni.upenn.edu/alumni weekends. We listed the dates of alumni weekends and then also a special event with the Penn Libraries, activism through a camera lens. Again, if you're just now joining us, I encourage you to introduce yourself using the Q&A button. Hello to Hillary from Boston, welcome. Hello to, let's see, Anchorage, Alaska, welcome to Roseanne. Glad you can join us from so far away. It's wonderful to see so many new people here. Hello to Erica from Chicago. Again, I'm Emily LaRosa. I'm Assistant Director of Penn Alumni Travel and Education, and we are just introducing ourselves using the Q&A before we get started. Welcome to everyone. Lisa from Sarasota, Florida, welcome. Welcome to Nicole from Toronto. I love to see different countries here. We'll get started in about 1 more minute. We're just introducing ourselves using the Q&A button. Let us know who you are and where you're logging in from. Hi to Steve in California. Good morning to you. Let me see, one more person. Let's see. Hello to Belinda from Seattle. I love all the West Coast folks. Welcome. Good morning to you. All right, well, it is noon. Well, just past noon, so we'll go ahead and get started. Again, I'm Emily LaRosa. I'm Assistant Director of Penn Alumni Travel and Education, and I will be facilitating Q&A at the end of your session. If you're just now joining us, we are introducing ourselves using the Q&A button. Let us know who you are and where you're logging in from. So while we're all staying safe at home this spring, this series will allow us to explore the world together virtually with Penn professors who will share their new and innovative research with us. And now that it's time to start, I'd like to bring in our host for today's program, Lori Glicklick, who is a member of the Penn Library's Board of Advisors. Thank you for joining us, Lori. The platform is now yours, and I'll see you all at the end of the session.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Emily. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for the Penn Global Discovery webinar series in partnership with Penn Libraries and Alumni Relations. My name is Lori Glicklick, and I am a member of the Penn Libraries Board of Advisors. What initially attracted me to the mission of the libraries was that the libraries are integral to the life of the entire university, impacting the students, faculty, and staff across all of the schools. Now, before I introduce our featured speaker, let me quickly run through a few housekeeping tips as we prepare for today's session together. First, I encourage you to enter your questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A icon. We'll do the majority of our Q&A at the end of the session, but if you are experiencing technological difficulties or have questions about Penn alumni resources, we will try to answer your question directly during the presentation. Please know that you will likely experience a delay during today's presentation as BlueJeans converts our live session into a stream, but we will see and respond to as many questions as we're able to and look forward to interacting with you. And now, at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker. James Pawelski is Professor of Practice and Director of Education in the Positive Psychology Center at the University of Pennsylvania, where he also serves as Adjunct Professor of Religious Studies. Having won a Fulbright Scholarship and earned a doctorate in philosophy, he is the founding director of the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project, which has been designated a National Endowment for the Arts Research Lab. He is the author, co-author, or co-editor of 5 books and the series editor of the Humanities and Human Flourishing book series with Oxford University Press. An award-winning teacher, he is the founding director of Penn's Master of Applied Positive Psychology program, a past president of the William James Society, the founding executive director of the International Positive Psychology Association, and a member of the executive committee of the International Council for Philosophy and Humanistic Studies. Professor Pawelski, thank you for joining us today. The platform is now yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Laurie. I really appreciate that very kind introduction. Thank you also to Emily, to Hannah, and to Sarah, and to all the other folks behind the scenes who are making this possible. And thank you to each of you who are joining us today. It would be a very awkward event if you had not made the time to join us. So I want to welcome you, and I'm excited about spending the next hour with you. I'm going to try to share my screen here, so give me just a moment, and hopefully you can see that slide. And so this is the beginning. Okay, fantastic, thank you. It's always reassuring to know that the technology is working these days. So I'd like to talk with you today on the topic, the positive humanities, enhancing human flourishing through arts and culture. Now, it may seem to you a little strange that I would talk with you today about human flourishing, because we're living in a time where we're experiencing a lot of challenge, maybe a lot of human languishing, we could say. Still in the throes of a pandemic and various issues in our society that have been brought to the fore in part because of the stress of the pandemic. The realization over the last year, especially in the United States, that the work of social justice is by no means over, that there is a lot yet to be done. The economic upheavals that have been happening, and then the ongoing political polarization. Well, I think that in the midst of all of those things, it's important to be aware of what is happening and to acknowledge the realities in the world. I think today it's all the more important, though, also to focus on human flourishing, because we know it's something that we can't merely take for granted. It's something we really have to think carefully about and work diligently toward if we are going to achieve it. Now, one of the obstacles to human flourishing is loneliness. Research tells us that loneliness can be more damaging to your health than obesity or physical inactivity or smoking up to 15 cigarettes per day. Loneliness is such an epidemic that in the United Kingdom, they, a few years ago, have established a minister for loneliness. One of the things that they're developing is this notion of social prescribing. So if you go to the doctor, you go to your physical doctor, your psychiatrist, they may prescribe to you in place of medication, they may prescribe to you a visit to the art museum or taking part in a choir, other kinds of social activities, because we're so starved for those social interactions. Obviously, these days, we need to find ways of doing that in a safe way. Dr. Vivek Murthy, who is the current Surgeon General of the United States, has identified loneliness as our greatest public health problem. And all of that was actually before the pandemic. That is to say, we had an epidemic of loneliness before we had a pandemic of the coronavirus. Now that we've moved into pandemic times, with all of the requirements for physical distancing, the loneliness issue has only become more and more salient to us. So how do we respond? What do we do when we are feeling lonely? Well, when the pandemic got launched, this is what Italians did. I'm sure we're all familiar with some of these images where Italians went onto their balconies and sang to each other as a way of connecting in spite of the requirements for physical distancing. You may be aware of the art museums that very quickly put priceless treasures online for all of us to be able to view for free to try to help us in these challenging times. Maybe less remarked, but no less important, A number of book clubs went online or even started online to help people connect through literature. Now, our research has indicated that there is a strong association between people who use the arts and culture as ways of coping in the pandemic and virtually every dimension of well-being that we measured, from positive emotions to satisfaction with life, from self-efficacy to optimism, from meaning and purpose to a sense of community and belonging. The arts and culture are really important for our human flourishing. Think about the role of music in your own life. Think about the role of literature, poetry, stories, narratives. Think about the role of film and theater and the role of art. Now, if you don't believe me that these aspects of arts and culture are important for our well-being, imagine a world in which they didn't exist. Imagine a world in which we had no music. None. No music. No lullabies, no music, no Spotify, nothing. No singing in the shower even. What if we had no stories, no literature, no poems, no fairy tales, nothing? What if we had no film, no theater, and no visual art? That world would be pretty bleak. Our flourishing would be pretty difficult to come by. So let's bring all of those back, because arts and culture are really important in our life. They're sources of vital meaning. They're load-bearing columns in the architecture of our soul. They're at the core of our culture. They're also at the core of our education. And so students take courses in the arts, the humanities, culture throughout their career in education. And they find these courses absolutely fascinating. Well, sometimes not. I suspect that each one of us could think back into our educational past and remember at least one course in the arts and culture that was not exactly scintillating. And I think this is because arts and culture can be used for so many different purposes. In schools, it's often used for academic purposes, for teaching us how to increase our reading comprehension or our vocabulary, or helping us to increase our writing skills. I know when I was in high school, I loved to do the reading of the book, the novel that I was supposed to read. I didn't really enjoy writing the book report about it though, right? So, but that was important for my academic development. Arts and culture are often used for economic purposes. We have these industries. We have the movie industry, we have the publishing industry, and so forth, and the music industry. And these industries help to bring us arts and culture, but they also are driven by economic interests. And sometimes these economic interests, like the academic interests, wind up occluding or eclipsing some of the well-being value, what I like to call the eudaimonic interests, eudaimonia, an ancient Greek word for human flourishing. These other interests sometimes eclipse the eudaimonic interests of the arts and culture. So I'd like for us to think for a moment. I'd like to invite you to think about a particular exemplar in the domain of arts and culture that has been important for your well-being, important for your human flourishing. Think about a particular song or other piece of music. Think about a novel or a poem or a poet who has been important in your well-being. Or perhaps it's a movie or a play that is important for you, or maybe a particular work of art. What I'd like to ask you to do, and invite you to do if you'd like, is to put the title of that work in the Q&A if you have something to recommend to others and you just like to report what has been important in your own life. It's amazing how powerful these things can be in our lives, not only in the moment, but also over the course of our lives. So what I'm going to do now is ask Emily if she would help us with a poll. So I'm curious to see whether you chose music or literature or film or art or maybe a poem or something else. So let's run that poll now, and let's see what we come up with.
Okay, James, the poll has been launched and we're watching responses come in. Just give us a few
Terrific.
more seconds.
All right, great. Curious to see what the results will be.
We'll give it a few more seconds, but so far music has taken the lead at 67%, but we're still waiting
Okay.
for more to come in.
All right.
Still going up. We have almost half of guests responding. I'll give you like 10 more seconds.
That's great, Emily. And while you're doing that, let me just note some of the things that have been entered into the Q&A. So I see the Liszt piano concertos. I see the Bach Brandenburg Concerti, Vivaldi's The Four Seasons, Handel's Water Music. Somebody got 3 for 1 in there. Those are all great ones, though. Rupi Kaur's poetry. Let's see, what are some other examples here? I see the movie Out of Africa. Wow, that's a great one. Mary Oliver, what a wonderful poet she is. Wild Geese, a great poem. And let's see, The Boss. Oh, I'm sorry, that was a note for me. That was not an exemplar, although that could be a really interesting movie, I think. But anyway, good. Well, so Emily, how are we doing with the poll at this point?
Yep, so I just ended the poll. Music wins at 45%, followed by literature at 30%, art at 11%, film at 6%, and poetry at 5%.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks to everyone who weighed in. You know, we're living in a time of unprecedented access to music. I mean, it's really astonishing if you think about what you would have had to do 100 years ago to be able to access music. You would have needed to be probably very wealthy to be able to have your own musicians playing for you, or you would have to be very talented or have worked very hard to learn a musical instrument on your own. Now, what you need is simply access to a smartphone. And if you don't have access to your smartphone, the person next to you is probably listening to music. We really live in a musical world, and that's one of the enriching things about our world. So let me see now, Emily. I'm a little bit. I've lost my slide. So can you help me? Do I just stop sharing and then wait?
Yeah, well, we can still see your slides, but if you want to stop sharing and share again, that's
Okay.
fine.
All right. I have kind of gotten a little bit stymied here with the technology, but I am now back on track. Okay, Emily, can we see them again?
Yep, looks great.
Fabulous, fabulous. Okay, so what we've just been doing, thinking specifically about these exemplars, thinking specifically about how music and literature and poetry and film and art and theater, and we could go on, dance and other kinds of art, of arts and culture, help us to flourish. This belongs to the domain of the positive humanities, and I'd love to introduce you to that domain now. But before I do, let me just remind us all what the humanities are. That's not necessarily something that a definition that we have in our hip pocket. The humanities are composed of a number of disciplines. Traditionally, they include philosophy, literature, history, religion, ancient and modern languages, law, theater, art, music. And again, there are other more contemporary disciplines in the humanities as well. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the humanities are defined as the branch of learning concerned with human culture. And culture is defined there as the distinctive ideas, customs, social behavior, products, or way of life of a particular society, people, or period, or the arts and other manifestations of human intellectual achievement regarded collectively. Okay, so the branch of learning concerned with human culture. Well, what are the positive humanities? Well, if we think about, again, this definition of the humanities as the branch of learning concerned with human culture, the positive humanities are the branch of learning concerned with human culture in its relation specifically to human flourishing. So the positive humanities are a new field of inquiry and practice concerned with the relationship between culture and human flourishing. Now, those two words, culture and flourishing, are actually botanical metaphors. The word culture comes from the Latin cultura, which means cultivation, cultivating a field. And of course, flourishing is what plants do, we hope, when we cultivate the field. So this is the outcome that we're looking for when the plants thrive. Now, applied to the human domain, then, human culture should result in human flourishing. So that connection is specifically what the positive humanities look for. Now, it's important to think about how we might proceed in this way. So if you're going to have a flourishing garden, or if you're going to have a thriving field of some sort of plants, you need to make sure that you pull the weeds. But if all you do is pull the weeds, then your garden is going to look something like this picture. Not inspiring, and come harvest time, you're going to be disappointed. It's also important to plant seeds. But if all you do is plant seeds, you're going to have something like this come harvest time, which looks like, I'm not sure, is that crabgrass or some kind of a weed taking over the garden? So it's important both to pull weeds and to plant seeds in the right balance so that we can have a flourishing garden, flourishing crops. This is an insight, actually, from positive psychology applied to human flourishing. It's important to be aware of obstacles to flourishing. It's important to do as mainstream psychology often does, to think about psychopathology. So what are the things that can stand in the way of our minds and our behavior going well? That's important to know. But positive psychology came along some 20 years ago and said, yeah, that's good. And we need to make sure that we're planting the right seeds. We need to make sure that we're focusing on our strengths, not just our weaknesses. We need to make sure that we're building the right things, not just repairing things that have gone wrong or trying to heal things that have gone wrong. Again, both of these are important. So when we talk about human flourishing in connection with the positive humanities, we want to have a balance between pointing out things that are obstacles to human flourishing, but then also making sure that we're focusing on the things on what flourishing itself is and on how to have more of it in our lives. So just very briefly, some of the things that we can think of in terms of what flourishing is or isn't. We want to think about moments. If you think about flourishing, you may think of this particular time in the Northern Hemisphere. May, oh my goodness. This is, April showers bring May flowers. Isn't that what we said as kids? So hopefully you're in a place where there are lots of flowers right now. And that's fantastic. That's a moment of flowering or a moment of flourishing. And we also want to think of flourishing from the standpoint of an entire year. Of an entire lifetime. And so it's important for trees, for example, to flower in the springtime, but also to lose their leaves in the fall. And that doesn't mean that they're dying. That means they're flourishing in a way that is appropriate for the fall season. So we don't just want to look at moments of, wow, this is fabulous, those are great moments, but we also want to take the entire life course into perspective. We can talk about plants flourishing. It's important also to talk about entire ecosystems flourishing. Look, if you have a garden and you allow the sun to shine only on one part of that garden and water only one part of that garden, you're not going to have a flourishing garden. Similarly, if we have a society where only certain people are allowed to have what they need to flourish, that's not a flourishing society. So we do want to think about individuals, we want to think about groups, we want to think about the society as a whole. There are certain things that plants have in common when they flourish. There are also ways in which different plants flourish in different ways. Carrots flourish in a way different from apples, for example. And so human beings, there are some things that we have in common in our flourishing, and there are ways in which individual differences also hold true. Human flourishing is not synonymous with privilege. Privilege does not guarantee flourishing. There are plenty of people who have privilege but are not flourishing. And privilege often obstructs flourishing, both for the people who have it and for the people who don't have so much of it. Flourishing and languishing, it's important to keep in mind, are bivariate. That is to say, we can flourish in certain ways in our lives and languish in others. My guess is that if we had the time to check in with everyone on this call, we would all be able to identify ways in which our lives are going well and ways in which our lives aren't going so well at this moment. And so it's important to understand flourishing and languishing not just as opposites where you're one or the other, but to consider in what ways are you flourishing, or in what ways is your community or your society flourishing, and in what ways not. Finally, it's important to think about human flourishing as not merely being about human beings. It also, of course, involves the non-human world. It involves the planet. It involves the broader picture, animals, plants, and so forth. Okay, so I'd like to share with you next a quote from Natalie Bondil, the former Director General of the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. She has said, "I am convinced that in the 21st century, culture will be to health what sports were in the 20th century. Cultural experiences will be seen to contribute to our well-being the same way sports do to our physical conditioning." Isn't that beautiful? If we think about what has happened from the standpoint of physical exercise over the last 100 years, at the beginning of the 20th century, it wasn't clear that exercise, especially for women, was a good idea. But over the course of the 20th century, culture has shifted in large part because there's been scientific evidence that has indicated that this is a very important thing for everyone to do. So wouldn't it be great if we can learn more about how cultural experiences can support our well-being as well? That will take a lot of cultural shifts. That will take some scientific collaboration as well. There is already beginning to be some policy recommendations on using the arts and culture for human flourishing purposes. A few years ago, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Arts, Health, and Well-Being in the United Kingdom published a report, Creative Health, the Arts for Health and Well-Being. In that report, they state there is an expanding body of evidence to support the contention that the arts have an important contribution to make to health and well-being. The What Works Centre for Wellbeing, again in the UK, puts together systematic reviews and policy reports on areas such as visual arts, music, and dance. And they point to research indicating that listening to music can alleviate anxiety and improve well-being in young adults. Listening to music can reduce stress, negative moods, and state anxiety in healthy adults, and regular group singing can enhance morale and mental health related quality of life and reduce loneliness, anxiety, and depression in older people compared with usual activities. So I'm very glad for all of those of you who identified music as an area in which you are relying on for your well-being. Obviously, other areas are good too, but that's an especially powerful one. Now, more research is needed in this domain. The Creative Health report also, the authors wrote, quote, "Evidence is unevenly distributed across the field, is of variable quality, and is sometimes inaccessible." So here are some questions that we need to address from a research standpoint. What are the specific health and well-being outcomes to which participation in the arts can lead? Under what circumstances are these outcomes likely to be achieved? What are the mechanisms or pathways through which these positive outcomes can be obtained? Are there situations in which the arts don't improve health and well-being? Are there occasions in which they're actually detrimental to them? That would be important to know. What are the processes by which we may be able to increase and even optimize the positive effects of the arts and humanities on well-being? Well, this is precisely the work of the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project, which I direct in the Positive Psychology Center at the University of Pennsylvania. I taught the first course on the Humanities and Human Flourishing in 2011 as part of the Master of Applied Positive Psychology program. I know some of my former students are on this call, so welcome to you in a special way. We got our first grant in 2014, and our aim is to understand and enhance the effects of engagement in the arts and humanities on the well-being of individuals and communities. We have a collaborative approach across disciplines and modalities within the arts and humanities. So how can we connect philosophy and music? How can we connect history and art, etc.? And then across divides between science and the arts and humanities. We believe it's very unfortunate that there's so much siloization between the sciences on the one hand and the arts and humanities on the other hand. And we believe that collaboration on this question of human flourishing is essential. Now, we've already published a couple of books The Eudaimonic Turn is an anthology of well-being and literary studies. We've also published a poetry anthology called On Human Flourishing. Those of you who selected poetry might want to check out this book in particular. And then my wife Susie and I have written a book, which is the first book applying positive psychology research to romantic relationships. It's called Happy Together, Using the Science of Positive Psychology to Build Love That Lasts. And in that book, we also relied on a combination of points from the arts and culture, relying on philosophy, for example, film to make some of our illustrations and points, and then also relying on science. So again, that integration is really crucial. So when we think about this Humanities and Human Flourishing project, there are three areas in which our work is progressing. I'd just like to tell you a little bit about it at this point. First of all, at the level of theory, we've been focused on conceptual development and instrument development. We've created a growing network of more than 150 leading scholars, researchers, and professionals. We have been focused on foundational publications to try to make sure that we're delineating the scope of the field of positive humanities and understanding what the underpinnings of that field are. We're so grateful for initial support from the University of Pennsylvania and the Templeton Religion Trust to get us launched in this work. We're also doing work in research on basic scientific investigation. We're looking to see if we can identify and measure the mechanisms, or again, the pathways governing the well-being effects of the arts and humanities. We're so pleased to have been designated a National Endowment for the Arts Research Lab, and so we're part of a network connected to the NEA for doing this type of work. We're currently looking for further funding to be able to continue and expand this work. So if you happen to know of any foundations or corporations or individuals who might be interested in partnering with us along these lines, please do put us in touch. We'd like to have those conversations. And then third, we're working in the area of practice. So this involves the dissemination and application. We don't just want to carry out work in the positive humanities for the purpose of learning some things, that's important, or even for the purpose of carrying out some scientific investigation, that's important, but it's important to put that knowledge and that research into practice. So we're beginning our work with cultural organizations, schools, universities, and governments to optimize well-being effects of engagement in the arts and humanities. This is a picture of our initial core team. I'm incredibly grateful to each one of them for their collaboration. We've been joined by a couple of postdocs, new postdocs as well. And this work has allowed us to bring together groups of scholars across disciplines in 8 different areas in the arts and humanities: philosophy, history, religious studies and theology, literary studies, art, music, theater, and film. Some of these scholars have been right here from the University of Pennsylvania, so it's been especially wonderful to be able to work with people like Jim English or Heather Love. Justin McDaniel, I know, was a former, presented in this series earlier this year, I believe. Peter Struck, Mia Bay, and other folks from Penn. So it's really, really fun to have these conversations. You know, what is the value of history for life? And to be talking with leading scholars in this domain. We have created a conceptual model to help guide the research in this domain. This will be on the test that we're going to have at the end of the hour, so please do study that carefully. Haha, just kidding. Aren't you glad you don't have to worry about a test at the end of this talk? Wow, that life is good. We've been focused on, again, I mentioned the mechanisms or the pathways that we think may help us move from engagement with arts and culture to human flourishing outcomes of various sorts. And so we've identified 5 that we think are particularly important. Immersion. This is where your attention is fully captured by the immediacy of the experience. You disconnect from the worries of everyday life. You feel carried away. Now, this one is really important because oftentimes when we engage with arts and culture, we're not really immersed. Think about going to an art museum. This is something that I'm sure we have all done pre-pandemic, and art museums are now opening up again, depending on where you are in the world. So hopefully you'll be able to get out to an art museum again soon. But when we go to art museums, we oftentimes don't really look at the art, do we? Honestly, we just kind of glance at it. we kind of browse through a room, graze through the room, and we don't really take the time to take that in, really to see the art. Now, I think that you can't see art if all you're doing is glancing at it. It's kind of like, going to a library and walking down a row of books and just looking at the spines and then getting at the end and saying to someone, wow, I sure read a lot of books today. Well, no, you didn't. You glanced at the spines of a bunch of books today, perhaps, but that's not the same thing as reading a book. Paintings are every bit as complex as books, and it takes a long time to be able to notice, observe what's happening in a painting. So immersion, we think, whether it's, again, art or even with respect to music or movies or other things, immersion is really key. It's really hard to be influenced by something strongly if it doesn't even enter into our perception. Expression is also really important in this domain. So this is where you're able to externalize your thoughts and feelings, often becoming more aware of them in the process. Think about reading a novel and, it seems like the writer knows you because they're writing about all these internal things that you didn't know anybody else had felt, right? Or perhaps you're doing some painting and that is helping you to express, or writing a poem, etc. Acquisition. This is when you have experiences that result in enduring insights, skills, or habits. For example, mastery experiences. So this is not just in the moment, but these are things that persist after the moment is over. Socialization, you're able to understand more clearly who you are and what roles you play in your community and your culture. So much of our identity is tied up with the music that we identify with, that we listen to, with the art that we view, with the literature that we read, etc. And then finally, reflection. You're empowered to intentionally reinforce adaptive habits, values, and worldviews, and transform maladaptive ones. Remember Socrates' famous point that the unexamined life is not worth living. Well, arts and culture can really help us to examine our lives. Now, if you look at the first, so immersion, we think, if you look at the first one of these pathways, of these mechanisms, we think that is a gateway one, a key to all the others. If we immerse ourselves in the experience, then these others are likely to be able to be activated as well. Now, it's possible to have subconscious experiences in some respects. If music is playing in the background, but you're not actually paying attention to it, that might have some effects on us, but not nearly the level of effect as if we're actually paying full attention to what is going on. So as part of the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project, we've also developed a toolkit of measures, which are on our website and can be used to measure the effects of, or the presence of these mechanisms, of these pathways in our experience with arts and culture. We have been working to put together the Oxford Handbook of the Positive Humanities. We're excited that this handbook is in press. It's due out in December of 2021. There are 38 chapters in it, and it reviews and synthesizes theory, research, and empirical evidence on how the arts and humanities can contribute to human flourishing. We're also actually literally working on 9 other books. We have a book series with Oxford University Press where we're focusing on one volume in each of the different disciplinary areas that we have been working with scholars on. So there will be a volume on history and human flourishing, for example, a volume on music and human flourishing, and so forth. Those should be coming out over the course of the next year or two. So as we kind of begin to wrap up here, I just want to share with you quickly some examples of our current research. I'll just give you 3 quick examples. First of all, looking at the effects of humanities courses on well-being. And oh, by the way, when I use the term humanities, positive humanities, I mean that also to be inclusive of the arts. I just want to underscore that. So what are the effects of courses in the arts and humanities on well-being? And again, some of you know the name Justin McDaniel, a dearly beloved professor in the Religious Studies department at Penn. And you may have heard of his course, Living Deliberately, where he basically asks his students to become monks for a time in the course. And so we were curious. I heard him talk about this class, and I thought, that is amazing and powerful, and how come he wasn't teaching that when I was in college? And then wouldn't it be interesting to look empirically, to have some scientific measures to see if we could understand more deeply what is happening with his students? How is their flourishing being affected over the course of the semester. And so we did a study, and I just want to share two quick results. In particular, I have to tell you, if you're not familiar with this course, Dr. McDaniel basically weans his students off of pretty much everything. They're weaned off of technology, no emails, no text, no Instagram, et cetera, et cetera. They're weaned off of words, like they're not allowed to talk to other people. They're weaned off of, well, not all of food, but their eating choices are severely restricted. They're weaned off of sex. I think by the end of the semester, they're weaned off of breathing too. I'm not entirely sure about that. But anyway, they really are restricted. So if anyone would feel lonely, you would think that it would be people who for a month have to have these really strong restrictions in their life. What we found was the opposite. Actually, his students reported feeling more connected, deeper connections as a result of that experience. Really interesting. They also reported having greater purpose, a greater sense of purpose in their lives. And both this sense of connection and this sense of purpose continued to grow even after they were done with that monastic portion of the course. So it would be interesting to continue that work and to look at the well-being effects of courses in the humanities, also of extracurricular groups. So some of you, when you were at Penn, may have been involved in some of the singing groups or the theater groups. I have no doubt that those have a tremendous positive impact on those who are involved with them. Okay, secondly, the effects of narrative technologies on well-being. This is collaborative work with Angus Fletcher, who is a world-leading authority on the structure of narratives. He's a professor at Ohio State University, and we're working collaboratively with him to see if we can identify particular technologies, particular techniques, particular moves within narrative processes that can help people to flourish. So are there ways in which authors can use techniques to help us feel connected with others, or to help us feel more optimistic, or to help calm our fears and have us worry less? So he's identified a number of these candidates, and we're beginning to look at those from a scientific standpoint. Then finally, I just want to say, looking at the effects of art museums on well-being. This is another area of specialization. I mentioned our two new postdocs. So Damien Crone is helping us specifically with the narrative technologies research, and Catherine Cotter is helping to lead this work on art museum visits and its effect on well-being. We're collaborating with the Philadelphia Museum of Art. We're beginning to nail down those plans for when the Museum of Art is fully open, that we'll be able to carry out this work there. And we're looking to see how museum visits can support human flourishing. Is it just going to the museum? Is that sufficient? Or are there specific things that you can do while you're at the museum that can help support that flourishing? So right now we have sent out a questionnaire to museum professionals to try to understand what their views are about the connection between museums and human flourishing. And we're developing a core survey to be able to administer to visitors from museums to see what their actual experience is. In the meantime, we have some hypotheses based on some of our experience. And I want to tell you about a story about one of my former students in the Master of Applied Positive Psychology program. She took the course on the humanities and human flourishing. And in non-pandemic times, I take my students on a field trip to the Barnes Foundation here in Philadelphia. In pandemic times, we've transitioned to an online art gallery, which is really cool as well. But in non-pandemic times, we take them to the Barnes, and I ask them to look around the Barnes. Hopefully you've been able to visit the Barnes, and you know there's so much wonderful artwork there. So I invite them to look around and then to pick one particular work of art that just speaks to them for some reason, and then spend at least 20 minutes looking at that work of art and considering how it is connected to their own flourishing. So 7-8 years ago or so now, one of my students was named Julie. Julie went to the Barnes Foundation and she picked this work by Toulouse-Lautrec. And she stood in front of it. And as she was standing there, she looked, she said, "Why was I attracted to this painting? This woman looks sad, but I'm not sad." And then she thought further and she thought, "But I am sad. Why am I sad? I'm sad because of my work." Now, Julie was actually Dr. Julie Hayslip. She was an intensive care pediatric specialist at the University of Virginia Medical Center. So if anyone found meaning in their work, you would think that it would be Dr. Julia Hayslip, but she was in danger of getting burned out. And she wasn't able to bring, she felt, her full self to her work. She wanted to work more on questions of well-being. And the context wasn't right for her to be able to do that in her work. So Julie continued to look at this painting. 20 minutes can seem like a long time if you're looking at one work, but it allows you to dig deeper into it. And so she thought, this woman not only looks sad, but she also looks determined. And furthermore, look at that window in the painting behind her. If she wanted to change her circumstances, she could. I'm determined, Julie thought. If I wanted to change my circumstances, I could. So how could I do that? And then she thought about the nursing school. The nursing school at UVA, there was so much more work going on there that was aligned with what she wanted to do. So on exiting the museum, she purchased a replica, a print of this painting, and took it home with her. Well, 6 years later, I ran into Julie Hayslip at a World Congress on Positive Psychology in Melbourne, Australia in 2019. And I said to her, Julie, you've got to tell me, what happened after you saw this painting? Was that just an interesting moment? Was it just an immersion experience that you had? Or were there enduring consequences and effects for your life? She said to me, James, that experience changed my life. I went home, I called up the nursing school and I said, look, I know you don't normally hire physicians, but I would love to work on bringing resilience and well-being to healthcare practitioners. And so the nursing school created a new position for her. Julie took a $50,000 a year pay cut and went to work in the nursing school and was able to feel like she belonged, was able to bring her full self to her work and help her colleagues increase their human flourishing. So how is it that we can engage with works of art or music or other exemplars in arts and culture in ways that can really help us with our human flourishing? So this was Toulouse-Lautrec à Montrouge at the Barnes Foundation that Julie selected and looked at. By the way, a columnist for the New York Times then actually interviewed me and interviewed Julie and wrote up that experience in the New York Times. So if you're interested in reading a fuller account of this, you can look up the column, The Art of Slowing Down in a Museum, in the New York Times. Well, this work is really a product of the University of Pennsylvania. So I am really pleased to be able to have the opportunity to develop this field of the positive humanities located here at the Positive Psychology Center at the University of Pennsylvania. I have had a number of conversations across the university. I mentioned different professors who are involved in this project as scholars and researchers. You may recognize this face as Benoit Dubé. Benoit Dubé is the Chief Wellness Officer at Penn. And he and I have had a number of wonderful conversations about the importance of arts and culture for the flourishing of students, for the flourishing of Penn as a campus, as a culture. So Benoit Dubé has joined our team and is working with us to help develop the field of the positive humanities, both in terms of that theory and the research, and then particularly looking to that application. We have begun collaborations with museums, including the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. We've had some great conversations with folks at the Met in New York City. I mentioned the trips to the Barnes Foundation, collaboration with the Philadelphia Museum of Arts. A couple of years ago, I was invited to spend 4 weeks in Adelaide, Australia. The city government invited me to come and work with them because they had a unit in the city government focused on well-being. They had another unit in the city government focused on arts and culture. Adelaide is known as the city of festivals. If you ever get to Australia, I highly encourage you to go to Adelaide. It's a fabulous city. And they wanted me to come and work with them to see how they could bring together their focus on well-being with their work on arts and culture. It was an incredible experience. We wrote up a report together, and they are continuing that work at a city government level, and really inspiring for other folks also to be able to emulate. So, in conclusion, We live in a world that has a lot of challenges. There are many obstacles to human flourishing in that world. One of those obstacles is a sense of isolation or loneliness that we oftentimes feel. And I think if we look at arts and culture, one of the foundational reasons why we have arts and culture is to help bring people together, to help bring people together in a very deep way. That was perhaps the number one thing that I took away from my 4 weeks in Adelaide. I talked with hundreds of people, dozens of organizations to try to understand better this connection for them between arts and culture and well-being and human flourishing. The thing that I heard over and over and over again among many, but the really salient theme for me was it helps us to connect deeply with other people. So I hope that soon we'll be able to go back to festivals and art museums live and engage with others. And in the meantime, there is a lot that we can do to experience the power of arts and culture, to experience the power of the positive humanities, to bring us together with other people, to help us connect deeply with the meaning in our lives and with the sense of purpose of how we want to live our lives, to engage others and to help bring our world to greater levels of flourishing. My contact information is there. If you'd like to find out more about our work, please visit humanitiesandhumanflourishing.org, where you'll find a lot of resources at that time. So thank you so much for your attention. It's been great to be with you. I think Emily now will join us for some Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much, James. That was wonderful. If you haven't yet submitted questions in the Q&A, please do so now. We have a limited amount of time, so we'll go ahead and dive right in. And if you want to stop sharing your screen at any point, you can feel free to do that.
Perfect.
I'd like to start with a pre-submitted question from Ruth. As you mentioned at the beginning of today's talk, we're living in particularly challenging times because of the pandemic. So Ruth wants to know if you've had to think about the positive humanities or positive psychology in a different way. Have you had to pivot and look at different things? Erica also brought up in the Q&A, did you notice a difference in the well-being effects of virtual art museums versus the barns? So how has this past year changed things for you?
Yeah, great questions. And yeah, it's interesting with positive psychology. I think most of us, when we think about flourishing, we think about blue skies, we think about maybe rainbows, butterflies, when everything is just perfect. And I have nothing against days like that. The sky is shining, the sky is blue and the sun is shining in Philadelphia right now, which is fantastic. And it doesn't always. And so there are rainy days, there are storms, and positive psychology and the positive humanities cannot simply be endeavors for sunny days and blue skies. They also need to be there to help us through tough times. And one of the ways in which we can most prepare for the tough times is to enjoy the good times and to build our resources, to think about what our strengths are, to establish these connections with music and with art and with movies and so forth. And then in those times when we're experiencing the difficulties, we can rely on those tried and true friends, as it were, to help carry us through. With regard to the digital version, one of the things that I've been really amazed by is how powerful the arts and culture can be on a screen. Now, with film, that's not surprising, but with other things, including ballet or art, I mentioned that in our class this year, I wasn't able to take my students to the Barnes Foundation for a field trip. So we created our own virtual gallery that we invited them into. And I'm really grateful to Laura Taylor in particular for helping to create that. I was just talking with one of my students just yesterday. And we were talking about the humanities and human flourishing class, and he was explaining how when he first, was signing up for the class, was going to take the class, he wasn't sure how that would really connect with him. But when he got into the class, he realized how important the arts and culture were for human flourishing. And I said to him, well, so what's one point in which your ideas began to change? And he said it was that virtual art gallery experience. So being able to focus specifically on one work of art, whether it's on a wall in a museum or on your screen for an extended period of time, and thinking about how that connects to our well-being is one of those things, Emily, that seems like embarrassingly simple, but until we actually do it, we might be surprised how powerful it can be.
Sure. I guess we should all be thankful that we have the technology to do those things this past year.
That's right.
One more pandemic-related question, then we'll move on. This is from Beth. She writes, home arts and lifestyle pursuits like interior decorating, gardening, baking, cooking, etc. seem to have new importance to well-being during the pandemic. These would probably not be considered under the humanities label, but is there any research or plan to research these types of activities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the short answer is we want to do everything. Like we're interested in looking at all of it, and we can't do everything all at once. So we're starting in certain places, but we're hoping that what we learn from those endeavors will really help to shed light on more of the kinds of activities that she's talking about. Look, I think creativity, I think autonomy, having control over being able to shape our environment. Those are really especially important things in a world in which we're maybe not feeling quite as confident about being able to shape other aspects of our environment. And so not that this is an escape from reality. We still need to be acknowledge and be mindful of what's going on in the world, but it's also important to continue to develop our own sense of autonomy, that we're able to manage certain things in our lives, even if we're not able to manage everything. And the kinds of activities she was talking about, I think, are terrific for that purpose.
Sure. It sounds like we have some teachers in the audience today. So I'm going to read two questions from what sounds like to be two different teachers. The first is Iris, and she asks, what would be some humanities-related activities that you would recommend to university students who wish to self-organize and to support their mental or improve their mental health? She's trying to design something for her students. And similarly, Roseanne asks, why are some people more amenable to turning to the arts and culture for well-being and others seem resistant? What should we teachers be doing to help our students who may not be so inclined to turn to the arts and culture for well-being?
Oh, goodness, those are terrific questions. I think I have two contradictory answers to Roseanne's question. And the first one is going to be, it's probably, I don't think that every person has to go to an art museum to experience human flourishing. I don't think that every person, needs to write a poem every day to do this. I think we all have our own ways of connecting in meaningful pursuits. I think that we don't know as much about the well-being effects of arts and culture as we should, and that kind of, that hampers us. Now, so on the one hand, I would say, yeah, it's probably best not to try to force people or to make them feel bad if they're not engaging in these kinds of things. Now, the contradictory answer I'm going to give is it can oftentimes be really surprising to those people when they actually engage in something. So maybe encouraging them just to try it. I think of my now 10-year-old son who turned his nose up at mangoes a few years ago when I was trying to introduce them to him. And I said, just take one bite and see if you like it. He loves mangoes now, of course, right? So just try something. It's amazing to me in the humanities and human flourishing class, I ask students to, go to the look at art. I then follow that up with the requirement to create a work of positive art, however they would define that. And so many students say to me, I never would have done this on my own. I haven't created a work of art at all since elementary school. I really didn't like this assignment, but then I got into it and I started it and then I loved it and I realized how much I missed it and so forth. So I think that giving people an opportunity just to try something, just to sample it, and then seeing what resonates with them and helping them, to continue. I think that would also be my advice to Iris as well with regard to the campus activities. Just try some things and see, sometimes people are already engaged in reading novels or in watching Netflix things or something, but they're not necessarily thinking about them from the standpoint of well-being and human flourishing. So maybe it's just having conversations with them about, what can you learn about what you just saw or what you just read or the music that you listen to that can be of help to you in your well-being journey.
Great, thank you for that advice. We are quickly running out of time, so I apologize to everyone who is submitting such great questions. We can't get to all of you. So I'll do one more question from Kate, who asks, the New York Times recently wrote 2 articles about flourishing and languishing as states of well-being. Did Positive Humanities coin the use of these terms this way? Are these buzz terms right now about well-being the way for a while that there are a lot of articles about mindfulness?
Yeah, great point. No, Positive Humanities actually didn't coin these terms. Flourishing and languishing are terms that have been in the domain for a while. A researcher from from Emory. Corey Keyes actually wrote a very influential article almost 20 years ago talking about languishing as an important consideration. And so we want to think about not just mental health versus mental illness, he argued, but also flourishing and languishing. So it's possible to flourish, at least relatively, even if you have a mental health challenge, or it's possible to languish, even if you are mentally healthy, that is, you don't have any particular disease. Those articles were great. I hope you also saw the one on dormancy. So there was a response to Adam Grant's article on languishing, terrific article I thought that Adam Grant wrote, but there was somebody else who said, yeah, it's not like I'm languishing. I just feel like I'm dormant. Like think of a plant that is dormant, right? It's maybe January, February, just waiting for the sun to shine, waiting for things to wake up again. And I think, Emily, that's probably a good place to leave it. I hope that everyone who is on this call, whether you're feeling at the moment like you're languishing or flourishing in some ways, or perhaps dormant in other ways, can maybe take this as an opportunity to re-engage with some of the arts and culture that maybe they've done in the past, or to try some new things, and to be open to connecting deeply with these artifacts of human culture. We have such access to these things, not only music at our fingertips, but also art images and things from cultures around the world across time. It's really extraordinary. And to be able to sample some of those things and to think about what they can teach us about our own human flourishing as individuals and as communities and a society is really an amazing thing to be able to take advantage of.
Well, great call to action. Thank you so much, James, for such a wonderful session. I'm going to sign off and send it back over to Lori. So thanks to everyone.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Emily. And thanks to all of you for your wonderful questions and participation. And a big thank you to Professor Pawelski for sharing your work with us. If you'd like to review any part of today's webinar or share it with a friend, the recording of this program will be available on our website within 1 week. As a Penn Libraries advocate, I want to say that the libraries provide many resources to arts and culture, whether it be online exhibits, access to streaming movies and musicals, or collections of art, photography, and other mediums. Penn Libraries serves as a vehicle of learning and discovery. Please be sure to check out our more library events over Alumni Weekend. Lastly, please take a moment to complete the short survey that launches at the end of this session. Your feedback helps shape future programming. Again, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.